Hello, and thank you for joining us for today's webinar, Tackling Hygienic Design While Maintaining Operational Efficiency. This discussion will last approximately 50 minutes, followed by 10 minutes of question and answer. Our presenters today are Darren Zare and Tricia Clark. Darren Zare serves as General Manager for Commercial Food Sanitation, LLC. 8 years as a plant manager capped a 22-year career with Kraft Foods, where he undertook various positions throughout operations, including quality analyst, operations supervisor, plant and corporate sanitation manager, business unit manager, and plant manager. Darren's focus on team and people development has been a significant part of successfully leading multi-million-dollar operations. He has led many initiatives in operational excellence, including commercialization projects, operations improvement teams, and improvements in sanitation, food safety, hygienic design, and overall efficiency. He is involved in numerous food industry groups and has spoken internationally on sanitation and food safety, hygienic design, and operational success. Tricia Clark serves as Vice President of Operations for EnSight Solutions. With over 25 years in the food processing industry, she has extensive experience in operations leadership, having roles in production planning, manufacturing finance, third shift operations and sanitation, customer strategy, to ultimately being responsible for overall leadership and regulatory compliance for multiple multi-divisional processing facilities. Her years of cross-functional experience provide strong manufacturing expertise. Tricia's passion for food safety and continuous improvement are evident given her focus on people, leadership, process development, customer experience, and industry advancement and collaboration. She understands the importance of communication when it comes to improving food safety. Thank you, Darren and Tricia, for joining us. Today, we will be covering questions we frequently encounter in the sanitation and hygienic design spaces. If at any time during our presentation you have a question, please submit via the Questions tab in the GoToWebinar toolbar, and we will respond at the end of our discussion. Or if we do not get to your question, Darren or Tricia will respond to you via email. We will also have 2 polling questions to help facilitate discussion. You will be notified when the polling question is made available. With that, let's move to our first question. Well, Tricia, how can OEMs and food processors work together to improve sanitation and product safety?
Well, I think manufacturing for many years was more around detection and repair, and that's really no longer an effective strategy. Now it's really prevention and prediction. That's really what's required to minimize risk and optimize productivity. And really, OEMs have to go. We have to develop a role beyond simply selling equipment, and that's where the sanitation process is so critical. Darren?
Yeah, thanks, Tricia. I want to talk a little bit about perspective. And when you think about an OEM and a food processor working together, one of the things that I would question is the OEM, do they have the perspective of the food processor, and vice versa? Does the food processor have the perspective of the OEM? We had a maintenance manager that came to our sanitation essentials training, a 2.5-day course, and we had been working with this company for a couple of years. And this maintenance manager also worked in engineering. He struggled with some of the improvements that we were recommending in their facility when, they were in a bit of a turnaround trying to get their sanitation and food safety right. On the start of the 3rd day of the course, he came up to me and he said, when you're talking about, the improvement that's needed, the changes in the equipment, the layout, the processes, I didn't really get it. And now I do. And it wasn't that in those 2 days he got so smart, but what changed was his perspective. He worked beside the food processors that were there at the training. He worked beside the people that worked in sanitation and food safety. And on the teams, when he was doing some of the tasks that we had them do in the training, he started to understand their point of view and their perspective and the challenges that they had. So that really changed his mindset. And his comment was basically, you're not going to have a bigger champion from here on out. I understand that. And so if you think about an OEM out there, what perspective do they have? Are they getting the perspective of the maintenance manager only, who's never been to that, or the engineer who's just trying to install a piece of equipment? or are they getting the perspective of that full food processor right across the board, the sanitation team, the maintenance team? You know, are they really getting that? Because I think when they get that, they'll start to understand more of the challenges. And the same thing with food processors. You know, are they really understanding the challenges the OEM has to deliver greatness? And ultimately, I think when they work together, you know, one thing to remember is good partners understand each other, and that is so critical here for that to happen. And I think that's a great way for improving sanitation and product safety is through that partnership and perspective improvement. And I think that gets to a bit of what Trish talked about on the prevention and that role beyond just selling equipment, and understanding each other is very critical in that.
And Darren, you know, I think also, I think it's a brand protection, right? I mean, it's insurance. It's insurance for that food processor to protect that brand, to really partner with the OEM, you know, to just try to drive improvement.
Yep, absolutely. Good add. So Luke, I think back to you. That brings us to the next question.
Sure. Darren, this is for you. What is the #1 principle for a food processing environment?
You know, I'm gonna work on a bit or focus in on design. You know, if you go from a piece of ground to a food processing plant, the first thing that happens is that plant gets built and the equipment gets installed and stuff. So the design is actually the first place that you can impact, you know, the food that's made out of there and the safety of it. And so we know that in food processing, the design of the food flow, the process that happens, so the kill step and all of that is very critical. And generally, the simpler or more focused that design is, the easier it is to see outliers, the easier it is to get a cadence and a routine around that. And so when it comes to the design of the facility itself and the design of the equipment and the layout, the same thing applies. So the more complex the design of that facility and the equipment is, the more complex the processes are generally that are needed to handle the control of the environment to make sure that it is a good environment for producing safe food. And so I think when it comes to the idea of the equipment design specifically, you know, having a plan to optimize that design and continuously improve that design. And that could apply to the layout as well, or even the facility. But having that plan is critical, and it won't be fixed overnight. But a lot of times we get that question of, you know, well, I'm not buying new equipment, so what can I do? Well, you know, there are opportunities to improve what's there. And I think that should be understood, because that idea of design being so critical, you know, for safe food production is very important. And I think this is also where you set the teams up in the plant for success. So having a very straightforward design can help them be successful in what they do. And this is also where OEMs can help a lot. They can help the customers be successful with what they have.
Yeah, I think for me here, probably the #1 principle would be to keep it simple. In some cases, I think it may be better to trade design for access. You know, I spent 4 years on third shift as a sanitation supervisor, and my #1 tool was a flashlight. I carried a flashlight around with me because if I couldn't see it, I couldn't clean it. And, you know, typically we would use the phrase, with a toothbrush and a flashlight, can this piece of equipment be accessed and cleaned? So I think simplicity, if something requires a lot of extra tools, or it's extremely hard to access or disassemble, it's very likely that it won't get done in an extremely effective manner. So I think simplicity needs to be really high up there on the list of important priorities, but obviously it's got to be executable. You know, you've got to be able to verify and validate that safe food environment, but certainly keeping it simple and always having top of mind accessibility and being able to get in and actually get it clean. I think we have a polling question now, correct, Luke?
We do. Everyone, how much do you agree with the following statement? My organization's sanitation processes are simple and executable. Okay. Well, it looks like we have no strongly agrees, 32% agree, 44% are neutral, and 24% disagree. So everybody's kind of in that middle category there, those three middle spheres. Darren and Tricia, y'all have anything to kind of say about that, about how people can get, better as being simple and executable in their planning?
I think those results kind of are very representative of the industry, where people, are in that mixed bag on where they're feeling on the sanitation processes. And some of it's, with equipment that's older and we're learning. And in other cases, maybe there hasn't been great partnership in making plans up front. And so the more you have that cross-functional team working on changes in the facility, the stronger that's going to be. And I think the more that will raise that to a situation where the sanitation process can be simple and easier to execute.
Yeah, I think the more people that you can involve and the more of a cross-functional mix you can have, you're gonna learn a lot about how to improve those processes. The people in the food processing plants, they know what they're doing. They've been doing this for years. Sometimes they don't look through the lens of someone else. So I think if the more people you can get involved from various different functions, you're gonna have some good knowledge there to figure out what processes are too complex and where can they be simplified.
Awesome. Well, thanks. That leads us to our next question. Tricia, what are ways OEMs and food processors can evaluate if they are aligned with current best practices?
I think on this one, Luke, for me, it's all about education. Do we have, I'm speaking from the lens of an OEM, having a lot of food processing experience, but do we have a process in place to educate ourselves against what those best practices are? For us as an OEM, it could be something as simple as a sanitary design checklist. Just evaluating as we're designing equipment, are we following this checklist? Are we really making sure that we are understanding what is our customer's biggest pain point? What is the pain point that we're trying to solve? What are their gaps and what are their risk areas? I think that's probably how we can best align ourselves. And then I think collaborating with industry experts, an organization like Darren's organization, who have so many years of expertise around food sanitation. I think collaborating with an organization like CFS can also really help us really get aligned with those best practices. Yeah,
I think education really says it well, Tricia. And I want to talk a little bit about engagement. I want to build on that collaboration side that you mentioned. There are a lot of industry groups out there that you can learn what's going on across your industry much better. So, it could be ABA, North American Meat Institute, it could be IAFP, AFI, United Fresh, the Food Process Supplier Association, FPSA. Those are all really good industry groups where you get to meet people from different companies that are really, in some cases, fighting the same battles in the area of food safety and hygienic design as you are, and you start to learn what they're doing. A lot of people will share good stuff around food safety because they're eating too. So everybody wants the food supply to be safe, and they'll share that stuff. And we have in our training classes, one of the feedbacks we've gotten from people is that they really appreciate working alongside people from other industries. So we'll have people from a bakery company, and then they'll learn from produce. Meat people will come in and they'll learn from bakery. So it's good to have that where you can engage within your industry. It's good to engage across your industries or across the different food industries or segments. And the other, another piece of this is companies can become very inwardly focused. So having that engagement across is very important, and really can't forget to engage across the globe. So different regions have different strengths, and some regions are very open to pulling in knowledge from other regions because they know they can get in this smaller thought process collectively within a region, and especially within a different food segment. And so there's an opportunity there. We had a president of operations for a multinational company tell us one time that he wanted us to see what was coming globally and what out there is great, because we know that when something has happened in one region of the world, it impacts the other regions. The regulatory agencies see what's happening, if there's issues, and they're going to look within their region or within their country and see if there's risk. So a lot of times you can get a different, or even get insight in what could be coming through that. So recognizing the power of that engagement, again, within segment or industry, across those segments or industries, and across the globe is very critical. And a lot of that can be done through education and stuff. And really hats off to EnSight for engaging in this process of having the discussion around hygienic design and food safety. I think we need more of that, and we need to continue to drive that across both the OEM and food processor segments or areas.
Well, I think it's important too, Darren, to just, we always have to remind ourselves that food safety is not proprietary. Like you said, we all eat. Every single one of us are eating. So, we all have an obligation to participate in ways that we can, help make food safer, depending on, of course, the industry that you're in, but it's not proprietary. So there's a whole lot of work that can be done for everybody to improve it and raise the game everywhere.
Thank you, Darren and Tricia. And the next one, I believe, is for you, Darren, to field first. What are some practical machine design elements that encourage sanitary practices?
Yeah, I think within this question is the fact that there are elements out there, and that's really important. I think Tricia talked about it earlier. There's hygienic design standards for, wet environment, the dry environment. 3A, EHEDGE are all out there, and it's important to really understand those, especially for the OEM and the food processors that are involved in bringing equipment in, or helping design layouts and maybe even facilities in some cases, or sections of facilities. And different elements, they're going to take on different meanings in different situations. So some become more critical in certain areas. But one that is probably universal in almost all situations, and Tricia talked on this, is accessibility. And, she mentioned that if you, basically if you can't clean it and inspect it and see it, how do you actually maintain it? And, so you really need that accessibility, and some of that can be relative too. And, some people would say, well, you can access it, but, it takes 20 minutes and special tools. That might not be the best situation when having that equipment down is lost production. So if maintenance takes a long time to have to be complex in accessing something, there's a lost opportunity on operational excellence. And same with sanitation. If they're getting pressured to, turn around the line in 2 hours or an hour or some time frame, having something that's hard to access is very difficult. So that's certainly an area that can be optimized better. And it is where hygienic design can drive operational excellence. So it's much more than just looking at it purely from a food safety lens. It's also looking at success from a company standpoint.
Yeah, you're absolutely right, Darren. I mean, it starts with, from an OEM standpoint, starts with that checklist. But to your point, I think the accessibility, it supports all of the other standards, on those checklists. So I guess for me, the biggest takeaway is, as an OEM, to really get familiar with, what is the problem that you're trying to solve? Instead of just selling a piece of equipment, let's sell a solution. And let's recognize that part of us selling a piece of equipment is to solve a problem for a customer, and that does include sanitation. So, it's easy to start with the checklist, and most of the checklists are, fairly straightforward, and will give you a lot of those design elements that you need to consider or look at the equipment that you're building and see what you can change. But I think it's going further and having that conversation with the customer. And not being afraid to dive into the middle of sanitation, even though it's not what an OEM does. I think it's there's a lot of good reasons for us to dive into the middle of that and have those conversations and really understand what are the challenges that the customer's facing and how can we design an equipment and solve those problems for them, or at least make it less of a problem. I think we have another polling question, Luke, I believe.
We do. And so what percentage of your current equipment could be retrofitted for increased accessibility? And we'll give everybody a minute or so to respond. And so you can see there's significant, about 47% of respondents said about 25 to 50%. And so Darren and Trish, are there any, simple things that can be done in the short term to address this?
Well, I would, I'd almost have a different thought on this, that, I talked about perspective earlier, and I wonder if the sanitation people would respond the same way. So the 25 to 50%, I wonder if there are little things that could be done to a higher percentage of equipment that would actually support more effective and efficient sanitation. But I do think with those numbers, again, it shows that even if a quarter of the equipment could be impacted, and if that translated to a 10% improvement just on that quarter of equipment, that can have a huge impact on an operation, not only on the efficiency, but also on effectiveness. So that could impact the number of times a pre-op fails. Absolutely. Or when swabbing becomes an issue. So there's a big opportunity, and obviously some of these retrofits can be costly and big. In other cases, they could be small tweaks. And I think that's where making sure the sanitation teams and the operations teams are involved in those discussions on what could be done is very critical.
Yeah, I would agree. I would almost, with these numbers, I would almost think you could do, call it a Kaizen event, call it a continuous improvement event, whatever. But get the right people in the room. To your point, Darren, get the sanitation manager, get the maintenance manager. They're going to have some pretty fast ideas and could probably prioritize very quickly which pieces of equipment pose the greatest risk, take the longest, are the biggest obstacles. So yeah, we might be surprised at how quick we could make progress on retrofitting some equipment.
Well, thank you both. This takes us to our next question. Tricia, what does the future of food sanitation look like?
Well, I think I think a lot of people would really be surprised and may be somewhat unaware of some of the budgets in some of the food processing plants for sanitation. Oftentimes, my experience was sanitation was somewhat overlooked. It was somewhat considered, the necessary evil, like the people on third shift just show up and clean stuff, versus always really looking at it as such a critical piece of the business. And in my opinion, production can't happen without sanitation and maintenance. So I think the future of food sanitation is we've got to really look at that as an opportunity to improve the overall business versus just this necessary activity. So I think there's a real opportunity to automate sanitation, to really think about how can we do this differently. And I even think to really, really get crazy and just step outside of the box of what's possible. We don't often think of sanitation and automation together, especially in a wet environment. But I think that, I think with the increases and advancements in technology, I think there is a real opportunity to automate that. And then I think just creating continued trusted partnerships for the user of the equipment to really, like I said, I've repeated it before, but to really understand their problems and their pain points. There's just so many continuous improvement opportunities for sanitation, but you got to really get in there and get involved. It can't just be treated like this activity that has to occur. It has to be treated as a critical, integral part of that food processing environment and an opportunity to improve it. So I think the deeper you can dive into it and really peel it back, there's so many opportunities to improve it. It could be just continuing to design equipment that requires less tools. Can I disassemble this without using a single tool? If so, then there is a much higher likelihood of that equipment getting cleaned and getting cleaned effectively versus if I have to use a lot of different tools. So I think there's just a huge opportunity to automate some of that, and I'm excited. I'm excited to see where it goes.
Yeah, I think I agree, Trish, especially on that automation. We're seeing technology take major leaps, and that ability to utilize that is so powerful. And if I take it on a broader scale and look at partnerships, so the partnership could be with groups or companies that haven't necessarily played in this food space, but they have technology that could make an impact on sanitation. And really, you look at the present. You don't have to look back very far. Look at the present and the future, and you see a lot of change. And now, Tricia may be too young to remember this, but I know when I was a teenager, you could not get a fresh salad. Very few places could you. Maybe at a sit-down restaurant, and maybe only during certain times of the year. And I don't consider myself that old, but now you can go just about anywhere that carries food and get a fresh salad. And that's a huge change, and that's in the US. But really, the eating habits and the supply chain has changed really every region of the world to some extent. And the fresh salad is a small example, but a huge impact to the supply chain. Just the ability to get something fresh all over the world, or in many areas of the world, is amazing. And the changes to the food supply chain to make that happen has really been incredible if you add it all up in totality. But to do stuff like that, it takes the whole food supply chain. We've heard the term farm to fork, and it sounds neat. It's easy to say, but it really is very prevalent, and it's only growing. So, really from the farm all the way through to where a person's eating at, that's really the future of food sanitation. It takes that whole supply chain all the way through the OEM and the food processor to be engaged. And so partnerships and the ability to collaborate, the ability to get perspective and support each other is really needed. And we see the change in the US. If you go to Asia, Latin America, they're going through even really bigger changes from where they were. Europe is changing. All these regions are going through significant change in how food is being handled and what's coming through the supply chain. So it really takes that partnership. And this is where, if I go back to kind of the start of this, the hygienic design and the impact on operational excellence, and if you put it in its totality along that supply chain, not just in the food supplier section or processor, sorry, not just in the processor area, but across the whole supply chain, that feels a bit daunting, but is very critical. And so getting that design right, again, not just the equipment design or the facility, but really the design of processes, really takes partnership. It takes collaboration to do that. And the OEMs and the food processors play a huge role in this. And they're going to be much stronger working together in making this happen. And it's definitely a win-win-win situation. So the OEM can win, the food processor can win, and of course us as a people eating the food win out of it as well, because then we have a better food supply chain and safer food and more options too. The fact that I can get a fresh salad, just about anywhere is great. It helps me eat better, and it helps all of us have better options and be able to eat more healthy. So I think that partnership, when you look at it across the whole supply chain, is very critical.
And Darren, I like what you said about non-food processors, helping to solve problems for food processors. Recently, I listened to a presentation by a professor from the University of Massachusetts talking about, it was micro bubble technology And it was really fascinating to talk about basically generating bubbles to clean parts and to do sanitation. So the food science department at UMass, is doing all kinds of just projects and tests, and it's just fascinating to listen to it. There's just so many different advances in technology, things that we've not even scratched the surface on, that I think can really change the way that we think about sanitation. And like you said, it's coming from a non-food processor, but could still have really great value and really drive significant change.
Absolutely.
Awesome. Well, thank you, Darren and Tricia. So we're moving into the open Q&A section right now, a little bit ahead of schedule, and that's fine. And so one of the questions that we did have, I'll get to that in a bit, but I want to remind everyone that to submit a question, go to your questions tab in the GoToWebinar toolbar. If you'll submit that there, we'll respond to it in the proper order. And if we don't get to it, Tricia or Darren will reach out to you via email and respond directly to you. And so we want to make sure that nobody's question goes unanswered. So with that being said, this one goes back to the question we had earlier, kind of an additional point, or if you'd speak to that a little bit more, dealing with simple things somebody can do to improve accessibility. And so the question is, what are some examples that you've seen of small things that could be done to improve accessibility?
Well, one thing and Tricia actually talked about this a little bit, so it might be a little redundant, but tools and the ability to access areas of equipment with non-specialized tools, or with something that's rather simple or ubiquitous. So you can use it throughout the shift, or the sanitation person can use it maybe on all the equipment that they're dealing with, if they need to open anything, but something that you can access that is either toolless, if you have it, properly guarded with, you can use electronics and that for guarding, but also have something that uses simple tools. That can make a big difference, for a sanitation team. So rather than having to deal with, 5 different tools, to access the equipment that they need to throughout their shift, maybe they only have one, and they have that at the beginning of the shift. They just carry it around, and that can save surprising amount of time throughout a shift where they're having to go get tools, or maybe go outside the room to get it, depending on the environment. That could mean literally another half hour of uptime or something, which can be, tens of thousands of dollars in some situations. So just that simple ability to think through what tools they need, keep them simple, or solve it with a different manner so that there is proper guarding still, but they don't need a tool to access it.
Trish, do you have anything to add?
No, I don't. I think I was I guess I wasn't thinking more in terms of access as much as sort of risk mitigation. I was thinking of just things like, watching your angles and not using the, like, for example, not using the flat bar and using it at an angle so that the water runs off. And I guess I'm just thinking of all of the areas where there's risk on the equipment. So I was coming at it more from that angle versus purely from the access standpoint. I think what Darren said is probably, as I think back to my years on third shift, I think what Darren said is probably the most important, was what is the most effective and fastest way that I can tear this piece of equipment down. So yeah, the less time I had to spend looking for tools was going to be the better. But then also the design, if you can design it in a different way, then I may not have as much to clean. If the piece of equipment is not allowing water to pool or product to build up, then that also creates some effectiveness. So I think it also still goes back to that design and really thinking through that design. Like I said, it may not necessarily be an example of access, but that design will be critical to the ability of the sanitation crew to get it tore down, clean, and back into operation.
Yeah, that's a great ad, Tricia. The easiest thing to clean is the one you don't have to, so that's good.
Exactly.
And we have another question. How much of an impact does hygienic design have on operational efficiency? Is it always a trade-off?
I would say from my experience, actually a couple of points here. When you walk into a plant that is designed well, from a layout, from the equipment side, you're usually walking into a plant that has great operational efficiency. That's not always the case, but I don't think I've ever been into a plant that you walk into and it's a disaster and it has great operational efficiency. They're usually streamlined and clean, and it gets right down to the equipment as well. So I would argue that hygienic design actually increases operational efficiency. Yeah. And I would say it's not even a straight line. I think it's exponential impact.
Yeah, I would agree. I remember an example when I worked on third shift. The company I worked for had bought just a simple barrel dumper. In terms of what it did, it was very simple. But the group that purchased it was not the group that had to clean it. And that thing had 25 bolts and a huge plate that had to be removed, a whole bunch of sandwich joints. And I remember me and my sanitation lead standing there looking at it thinking, thank you so much for this gift that you've just given us, because it was absolutely so difficult to clean. A simple barrel dumper, just a simple barrel dumper. So I think hygienic design and operational effectiveness and efficiency go hand in hand, because what should have been a very simple application, a very simple piece of equipment, added a significant amount of time, and I had to devote one entire resource to disassembling this, cleaning it, and putting it back together. So I think, had they gotten more people involved in that decision before that simple barrel dumper was purchased, we may have been able to, to make some changes that could have made that a much simpler process. So to me, hygienic design and operational efficiency are almost the same as sanitation and maintenance. I feel like they're integral. For you to have an effective, like you said, Darren, for you to have an effective food safety sanitation program, you have got to consider hygienic design at some point. And if you haven't yet, that's okay. It's a great place to start. But it is amazing what changes in design. It's exponential, the improvements that it will make.
Awesome. Another question we have: does hygienic equipment cost more? Does it always cost more? And if so, how can we get upper management involved and convinced in how to invest in it?
I think it's all about the business case, Luke. Might it cost more? Perhaps. But I think the mistake that we make is not really presenting a business case and not peeling the onion back, so to speak, enough to recognize what is the return on spending that money for that hygienically designed piece of equipment. What's the return going to be on that? Kind of what I said earlier, there is an amazing amount of money in the budget of a sanitation program. So, if someone would put together a business case and really peel back the information on their budgets and where they're spending their money on sanitation, I think you would see a lot of trade-offs. So yes, you might pay a little bit more for that piece of equipment up front, but you might get a great return on it in terms of reduced labor, reduced sanitation chemicals, reduced water usage, turn time, being able to get that piece of equipment cleaned and back in operation, which is obviously going to be generating revenue if it's running. So I think it's all in the business case that is presented for why we need to convince upper management that we need to invest in this improved design.
Yeah, and I don't want to speak on the cost of a better hygienic design equipment with an OEM on the call here, but I could argue that better hygienic designed equipment should cost more. The OEM is invested in really helping, if I was a food processor, helping me as a food processor have a better food safety program. So is that worth something? Absolutely. The one thing I would mention is that we had worked with an OEM and worked with them on their hygienic design, and they had made a number of improvements. They took it to heart, and we trained a number of their engineers, and they made some significant changes to their equipment. And it was a couple of years later, I saw a presentation they did, and they talked about their journey before really learning about hygienic design and after. And they showed their sales, and their sales really made a big change. There was a direct impact at that juncture when they started focusing on hygienic design. And I think when I look at that, I look at the fact that, yeah, it was a good business case for them, of course, as an OEM, but the fact their sales went up as much as they did, clearly who they were selling to, the food processors, saw value in the changes they made. And so I think that really it is almost a case study to what Trish is talking about. That is that case study on the impact that new or that better designed equipment made to that food processor. And you know, they recognize, those food processors recognize the impact it made to their food safety and sanitation programs in an improved manner. So I think very powerful there. So the question probably is wrong, that does the equipment cost more? It really should be, how much does it impact my my process and my facility in a positive way?
Absolutely. And Luke, you know, one plant that I was at, we had $7 million built into our budget for lost product, for just scrap, for literally just for product just getting hung up in the piece of equipment or hitting the floor, you know, ultimately not making it into that package that it was going to go to the consumer. So we had $7 million budgeted every year to lose. That's an enormous amount of money. I mean, it was a big plant nonetheless with a lot of different divisions, but that's an enormous amount of money. So if you think about, you know, if I design this piece of equipment differently so that product doesn't get hung up, so that I am easier, I can access it easier, or the product can flow more freely and make it to the end package, that's $7 million just in that one area of the budget that was costed specifically around losing product. So, you know, there's a significant impact to the business when we start looking at from the front door to the back door, where the losses are and where we can capture them. And the design of the equipment obviously is going to play a huge role in that.
Awesome. Well, there's one question that I know that we get, and it seems to be pretty you know, recurring in recent, you know, at least in recent months and year, and that is, should OEMs provide end users info on how to clean their equipment?
Yes, you're right. We do get asked this on an occasional basis, and you know, it's a hard one to answer, because you know, the easy answer is to say no, but we certainly want to partner. You know, at EnSight particularly, as well as other OEMs, you know, we recognize the need to be trusted partners with our customers. So we don't want to automatically say no. But at the same time, I think we have to recognize we're an OEM. You know, we are not in the daily battle, in the daily grind of processing food. So generally what we try to do is provide information on how to disassemble the equipment. We try to provide information on various different parts that we believe they should be mindful of, that they should take out. You know, we try to provide as much information as we can regarding the disassembly and reassembly of that equipment. But it's very, very difficult for us to tell them how to clean it, because we are not the regulating body. And, you know, so generally our response is, we'll walk you through the areas that we believe are a concern, but ultimately that response, you know, in that direction really needs to reside with the owners of the food safety program within that particular food processor, because that's the group that is going to have much greater expertise. They're going to know what chemicals they're using. They're going to know their product line much better. You know, what are the soils and greases and fats, and we're not experts on that on the OEM side. So we'll, you know, like I said, we'll generally provide a lot of information regarding the disassembly and reassembly, but we're gonna lean on that food safety program in that food processor to be the final voice and the expert on how to clean.
Yeah, I remember working in the plants when we would get a SSLP written by an OEM, And it would come part of the package. So the engineer for our company thought they were doing a great job. Hey, I got an SSOP from the OEM. Well, the first thing we would do is write our own SSOP, because it wouldn't match the SSOPs we already had in our facility. It wouldn't necessarily match the chemicals, any of that. So we would tell them, don't get the SSOP, but get what Tricia just talked about. Get what are the materials? So what do I got to watch out for? How do I tear it down? So I want good visual on that. And ideally, before we get the equipment in, we've been to the facility, whether it's part of a factory acceptance test or almost a sanitation checkout, where you tear it down and you can look at the equipment and then start to write that SSOP with the OEM potentially, especially on the teardown side and putting it back together on how to handle it. And it's really the same question as should I be told how to maintain the equipment? So you want to know the basics and stuff, but you don't want to have a final, because you're still going to, in your facility, want to put it into your system, whatever your MMS system is.
Right.
You're going to want to put it in. So it's really that same concept. I want to know the top line stuff. I want to know the stuff that's unique with this. I want to know how to tear it down, put it back together. I want to know if there's any components that are susceptible to different chemicals than what our plant uses, susceptible to the chemicals our plant uses, or am I going to need a different chemical, which usually is not the equipment side. It's usually the material side. So I think that's the stuff I would want to know as a food processor, and I don't necessarily want an equipment manufacturer tell me how to clean it to the full load of whatever I have on it, whatever protein or whatever food particulates I have on it. They're not going to know how to deal with that nearly as well as my own team will.
Awesome, and that leads us to our next question. Is there a downside to hygienic design? And if so, what?
Wow, that's a great question. Is there a downside? I sure can't think of one. I mean, as an OEM, I can't think of one other than to, maybe the learning curve. I mean, I wouldn't say that's a downside, but it certainly challenges the way we have done things, right? So we have to constantly be challenging ourselves and asking ourselves, how can we make this piece of equipment better? And so I would imagine, depending on who you ask, that can be a painful process, depending on where they are in the process, depending on their role in the organization. I suppose that could be somewhat painful, but I certainly don't believe that there is a downside, because it's similar to what we talked about before. I think there's just so many opportunities for improvement and so many opportunities to truly impact the business results of an organization with hygienic design that I really can't think of a downside.
Yeah, the only thing I could think of is kind of misapplied hygienic design. So equipment needs to be operational first. It needs to perform its function. The most hygienic designed anything is nothing. So the equipment has a purpose. It's got to handle its purpose first. So if that's forgotten, and then people safety, the immediate people safety could be a risk. If hygienic design trumps that, and then someone gets hurt right there, that would be misapplied hygienic design. And I think people just need to, when they learn the principles and stuff, they got to keep it in context. So first comes the operational side, and then within that, it's got to be people safety, and then within that has to be the hygienic design. So they all need to play a role in there, and it needs to be kept in context. So I think that's where there could be a miss, where hygienic design trumps people safety, and then someone at the plant pays the price because of that. I think that could be a risk. And then and I'd forgotten the other one I was thinking of actually. But I think either way, I think they're misapplied. There's no downside to truly doing it. the downside if it's misapplied. Oh, actually, I remember now. So if focusing on hygienic design trumps process within a facility, so if I'm on sanitation and I'm the sanitation manager and I'm so focused on the fact this equipment's designed bad and I don't focus on doing the job right that day, so I don't focus on getting the right SSOPs in, even though it may take me a half hour longer. I may have visual sight on improving this equipment so I can be more efficient or my team can be more efficient, that I lose sight of the fact that I still got to do the job day to day. And I'm so critical of the design that I've not taken care of the store at the moment. And I think that's another way that it could be misapplied, that it's looked at as the end all while not dealing with reality of today. So it's those two situations, but I think they're both things are taken out of context and it's misapplied. It's not truly looking at improving things.
Yeah, and I think, I would encourage any OEM and any food processor for that standpoint, to really collaborate. I know that for us at EnSight, we have learned so much from CFS, Darren, and you and your crew. There's so much opportunity and there's so much expertise out there. So I don't think we have to beat ourselves up, whether we're the OEM or whether we're the food processor. If we feel like we're lacking knowledge or lacking some expertise, there are industry experts that can help with that. So I think collaborating with an organization like CFS, whether you're the food processor or whether you're on the OEM side, can bring such clarity to hygienic design. So if you're the food processor, I think, you could, if you felt like you didn't have enough expertise on hygienic design, I think you could certainly partner with an organization like CFS that could give you some pointers and some tips and maybe some things to consider. And likewise on the OEM side, if you're not familiar with it, don't have enough understanding of it, collaborate with a company like CFS, get the training that you need, have them give you some feedback on various pieces of equipment that you're designing and saying, hey, what do you think? Where do you think we can make improvements? What do you think of this design? So I think there's such an opportunity to educate ourselves and so much industry knowledge and experts that are just willing to partner with us and help, that there's really no reason that everybody can't learn and grow in that area.
Luke, with kind comments like that from Tricia, I have nothing to add.
That owes me $20.
Well, there you go. We'll settle it later. So we have time for one more question, and so this is an interesting question. I like this question. At what point does hygienic design simply become the standard in a way that it doesn't drive purchase price? And so I think what somebody's trying to get at is, when is the innovation for hygienic design basically become so standardized that it doesn't impact the end price of the machine?
Well, I'll take a kick at this, and then Tricia, you're on the OEM side, so you'll probably have a better feel for this. But I would say it happens all the time. And so my point here would be is if you look at valves in the dairy industry and you go back 20 years or 30 years, there was a point where there was a change and they became more sanitary, and then it became the standard, and everybody was selling kind of the same principles in the valving. And the same thing to some extent in other aspects of equipment. If you look at different industries where there is some innovation or some change that's made, pumps, that it just becomes the standard, and it's harder for companies to compete if they haven't adjusted to that standard. And so I think it depends on, in my field, I guess, it depends on the type of equipment and where it's at and the industry. But as these things are changed, they just become the standard. So I can't tell you when the, pick of a piece of equipment, when that will become the standard, but at some point it will. It's going to change, and it's going to be in different aspects of equipment that are going to make that change. So I think it's happening all the time. We just don't necessarily see it because it's not like it's happening across every industry and every piece of equipment at all the time.
Yeah, I think it becomes the standard when you stop having recalls, when you stop having positive swabs, when you have fixed the root cause of the problem. You know, then I think you might know. Then I think you might know you've arrived. But as long as there are food safety concerns, and as long as there are recalls, and as long as there are, you know, positive Listeria and Salmonella swabs, then there's always probably something that can be done to improve that design and to improve that process. But I think Darren, you know, I think Darren said it best. I think it's just going to take time for, you know, and some of them will just become the industry standard. But I can't imagine it ever completely going away until you've really resolved the food safety risk completely.
Yep.
Well, thank you both. And I think with that, that's a good place to end it. We're about a minute shy of our time. And so I want to thank everyone for participating today. Thank you all for joining us in this discussion. Thank you, Darren and Tricia, for your input and sharing your expertise and knowledge with everyone. As a reminder to everyone that attended the webinar, you will receive a recording of this presentation along with the slide deck and along with contact information. As you can see here on this slide, it will be made available as well if you have any questions for Tricia or Darren. And if we did not get to your question, we will follow up with you directly via email. Thank you, everyone, and have a good day.